Empire of the Sun is a 1984 novel by the English author JG Ballard, and it is heavily inspired by the author's own childhood experiences in a Japanese internment camp in China in the 1940s. Here is a quote from the introduction by John Lanchester, which gives you an idea of what kind of an author JG Ballard was, having had such a peculiar and traumatic childhood experience. A number of themes that run through Ballard's work are crystallised in Empire of the Sun. All his novels give a powerful sense that the reality in front of our eyes is never much more than a stage set, a temporary scene that can be instantly and irrevocably swept away. This isn't a benign, Humean or Buddhist sense that reality is an illusion. It's much more pressing than that. In Ballard's novels, any apparently settled reality is prone to be dissolved and reconfigured. So, to get an idea of just how this is, I'll read two passages, one from near the beginning of the novel and one from near the end. So, the main character, Jim, just like JG Ballard when he was a little boy, was born in Shanghai in the early 1930s and never learned a word of Chinese because his parents were wealthy English people. And after Japan invaded China in the 1930s, they still left the foreigners in Shanghai alone, and it was only after the bombing of Pearl Harbor that Jim and his family became prisoners of war. That JG Ballard and his family became prisoners of war, or in this novel, just Jim goes into the internment camp on his own. So here is a quote from near the beginning, which is seen from the point of view of a child, and it is about dead bodies that get dumped into the Yangtze River because their families can't afford a proper funeral. The light advanced across the river, picking out the paper flowers that covered its back like garlands discarded by the admirers of these sailors. Every night in Shanghai, those Chinese too poor to pay for the burial of their relatives would launch the bodies from the funeral piers at Nantao, decking the coffins with paper flowers. Carried away on one tide, they came back on the next, returning to the waterfront of Shanghai with all the other debris abandoned by the city. Meadows of paper flowers drifted on the running tide and clumped in miniature floating gardens around the old men and women, the young mothers and small children, whose swollen bodies seemed to have been fed during the night by the patient Yangtze River. It's a great line. And toward the end of the novel, when Jim has spent several years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, just like JG Ballard did in real life, and this again is seen from the point of view of a small boy, albeit a small boy who has experienced horrors that most people never have to go through. In the cell at the far end of the yard, shaded by a straw mat hung from the bars, was the body of a dead Japanese soldier. He lay on the cement bench that was the cell's only furniture, his shoulders lashed to the remains of a wooden chair. His head had been bludgeoned to a pulp that resembled a crushed watermelon, filled with black seeds of hundreds of flies. Jim stared through the bars at the soldier, shocked that one of the Japanese who had guarded him for so many years should have been imprisoned and then beaten to death in one of his own cells. Jim had accepted Private Kimura's death in the anonymity of the flooded paddy field. But this reversal of all the rules governing their life in the camp at last convinced Jim that the war might be over. So it's a really great read, really harrowing novel, but also a genuine page-turner, and I also strongly recommend the film version from the 1980s, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Christian Bale as a child actor, as a young Jim, and also John Malkovich as Basie, who ends up in the same prisoner of war camp as Jim. So, strongly recommended.